Hi, everybody. Lara Green here with the Time with Young Disciples. This one will be a little longer than usual because we're going to hear a story that I grew up with and I've loved, and I think it really kind of changed my life when I heard that story. But before we get to the story, I want to ask you, have you ever shared something with someone else? I wonder what it was. I wonder who you shared it with. How did you even learn how to share? Why do we teach people to share? Why is that important? All those things. So, before we get into today's theme, the word of the day, 2 weeks ago, I talked about the story that goes with the sermon from 2 weeks ago. We remembered that God is with us all the time. And God makes sure we have everything we need, especially for each day. So we heard the manna story. And then we made manna bags that day at church, some of us. It was a really cool day. And then last week, we released. We took in a deep breath and then let it go. And we talked about what might we be holding on to, that if we let it go and we let God's love into our lives, we might be able to do more. That what do we need to let go of that God wants us to let go? So that's the last ones. Today, the word is reimagine. Do you imagine? Do you have an imagination? I know you do. You guys come up with the best ideas. So today we get to use our imagination and reimagine a world where God's love reaches everybody and there's enough. So let's get to my story. This is a written down version of a story called Stone Soup by Margaret Brown. Now, before it ever was written down, this story was told as a story from grandparent to parent and parent to child by the oral tradition, words from generation to generation, until finally people could write and they could write the stories down. And some people say this story first was written down in French. Can you imagine? Isn't that cool? But a lot of countries tell a version of this story, and you can find lots of different copies. So today's, again, is Stone Soup. It's printed by Aladdin Press. And we're going to read it together. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. Here we go. 3 soldiers trudged down a road in a strange country. They were on their way home from the wars. Besides being tired, they were hungry. In fact, they had eaten nothing for 2 days. "I would like a good dinner tonight," said the first. "And a bed to sleep in," said the second. "But that's impossible," said the third. "We must march on." And on they marched, until suddenly ahead of them they saw the lights of a village. "Maybe we can find a bite to eat there," said the first. "And a loft to sleep in," said the second. "No harm in asking," said the third. And now the peasants of the place feared strangers. When they heard that the soldiers were coming down the road, they talked amongst themselves. "Oh, here come 3 soldiers. Soldiers are hungry. We have little enough for ourselves. So we must hide our food." They pushed their sacks of barley under the hay in their lofts. They lowered the buckets of milk down into their wells. They spread old quilts over the carrot bins, and they hid their cabbages and potatoes under the beds. They hung their meat in the cellars. They hid everything they had to eat, and then they waited. The soldiers stopped first at the house of Paul and Francois. "Good evening to you," they said. "Could you spare a bit of food for 3 hungry soldiers?" "Oh, we have no food for ourselves for 3 whole days," said Paul. Francois made a face. "It's been a poor harvest." The soldiers went on to the house of Albert and Louise. "Could you spare a bit of food and maybe have a corner where we could sleep the night?" "Oh, no," said Albert. "We gave all we spared to soldiers who came before you, and our beds are full," said Louise. At Vincent and Marie's, the story was the same. It had been a poor harvest, and all the grain needed to be kept for seed. And so it went on throughout the village. Not a peasant had any food to give. They all had very good reasons. One family needed to use their grain for feed. Another had an old sick father to care for. All of them had just too many mouths to feed. The villagers stood in the street and sighed. They looked as hungry as they could. And then the 3 soldiers started talking and thinking. The first soldier called out, "Good people," and the peasants all drew near. "We are 3 hungry soldiers in a strange land, and we have asked you for food, and you have no food. So then we must make stone soup." The peasants stared. Stone soup? What's stone soup? That's something we should know about. "First, we will need a large iron pot," the soldiers said, and the peasants brought the largest pot they could find. "How else to cook enough?" "Oh, that's none too large," said the soldiers, "but it will do. And now, water to fill it, fire to heat it." It took many buckets of water to fill the pot. A fire was built on the village square, and the pot was set to boil. "And now, if you please, 3 round stones." Well, those were easy enough to find. The peasants' eyes grew round as they watched the soldiers drop the stones into the pot. "Now, any soup needs salt and pepper," said the soldiers, and they began to stir. The children ran to fetch salt and pepper. Now, stones like these generally make a perfectly good soup, but oh, if there were carrots, it would be so much better. "Well, I think I have a carrot or 2, said Francois, and she ran off, and she came back with an apron full of carrots from the bin that she had hidden beneath the quilt. "Oh, a good stone soup should have cabbage," said the soldiers as they sliced those carrots into the pot. "But no use asking for what you don't have." "Oh, well, I think I could find a cabbage somewhere," said Marie, and she hurried home. Back she came with 3 cabbages from underneath the cupboard under the bed. "Oh, if only we had a bit of beef and maybe a few potatoes, then the soup would be good enough for a rich man's table." And the peasants thought it over, and they remembered their potatoes and their sides of beef hanging in the cellars, and they all ran to fetch them. A rich man's soup, all from a few stones. It almost seemed like magic. "Ah," said the soldiers, as they stirred in the beef and the potatoes, "if only we had a little barley, and a cup of milk, this soup would be fit for the king himself. Indeed, he asked for such a soup when he dined with us." The peasants looked at each other. These soldiers had entertained the king well. "Oh, but it's no use asking for what you don't have," said the soldiers, and they sighed. The peasants brought their barley from their lofts, and they brought milk from the wells. The soldiers stirred in the barley and the milk into steaming broth, all while the peasants stared. At last the soup was ready. "Now all of you shall taste," the soldiers said. "Oh, but first a table must be set." And great tables were brought out and placed into the square, and all around they lit torches. Such a soup, and how good it smelled, truly fit for a king. But then the peasants asked themselves, well, gosh, wouldn't such a soup require bread and roast and cider? And soon a banquet was spread. Everyone sat down to eat. Never had there been such a feast. Never had the peasants tasted such soup. And fancy, it was made from stones. They ate and they drank and they drank and they ate, and after that they danced. Oh, they danced and sang far into the night. Now, after that, they were tired, and the three soldiers asked, "Is there not a loft where we could sleep?" "Oh, but let such three wise and splendid gentlemen sleep in a loft, indeed! You must have the best beds in the village." And so that night, the first soldier slept in the priest's house, and the second soldier slept in the baker's house, and the third slept in the mayor's house. The next morning, the whole village gathered in the square to send them off. "Many thanks for what you have taught us," said the peasants. "We shall never go hungry now that we know how to make soup from stones." "Oh, it's all in the knowing how," said the soldiers. And they went down the road. I just love that story. And I think it's really cool to see how the villagers were scared of the soldiers at first. And by the end of the day and that night, they were dancing and feasting and inviting the soldiers into their homes. And I wonder why. I wonder why the soup making made them so happy. I wonder what role those stones play in the soup. I wonder, can sharing make us rich? There's two stories today that go with the sermon. One is from the Gospel of Mark, and one is from the Old Testament in Leviticus. In Mark, we hear about the widow, and when she goes to temple, and she gives just her penny, something like a penny to us today. Everything she had very little, and so for her, a penny was a lot. Whereas rich people were walking right past and giving nothing, and they could have given many pennies. And Jesus noticed the widow and pointed out, this woman is giving everything she has to share for God. What can we learn from her? And how can we help her keep that penny so she can eat and take care of her? In Leviticus, we hear about the story in the Old Testament where God's people, the Israelites, were taught to celebrate a special time of the year where they would intentionally share everything they had with each other, their crops, their money, to make sure everyone had enough. Kind of like the stone soup. So, things to think about. Maybe you're giving things to your neighbors and taking care of your neighbors. Maybe this is the time of year we talk about giving our little bit to the church. Kind of like the church is a great big soup pot, and we're putting our little bit. And when we stir it all up, there's enough for everybody, and we can share even more than we might have been able to share by ourselves. So you can be part of that. What do you have to share? How can we be part of imagining God's world in a place where some people have a lot and some people have nothing? We change that, and everyone has enough. Can you imagine? Use your imagination. All right, let's close in prayer. Thank you for spending a little extra time with me this week to go over those things. Dear God, thank you for caring for me, for being with me, and to helping make sure I have enough of what I need each day. Help me reimagine your world where everyone has enough. Amen. All right, friends, I love you. I will see you next week. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.